You don't fix a jet by listening to a computer. You fix it by listening to the machine. The words weren't loud, but they cut clean through the rising tension on the tarmac like a blade through still air. No one answered him. No one even looked at him at first. Because right in front of them sat an F-16 Fighting Falcon, nose angled slightly into the late afternoon sun, its gray skin shimmering in the heat haze, its canopy closed like a sealed secret, and it was dead. Completely dead. The ground crew had been working for over 2 hours under a sky that offered no relief, sweat darkening their uniforms, laptops open on rolling carts, diagnostic cables snaking across the concrete like lifelines that led nowhere. Every system checked came back green. Fuel pressure, nominal. Electrical, nominal. Flight control systems, perfect. And yet the jet refused to breathe. Lieutenant Ryan Carter stood at the center of it all, jaw tight, arms crossed, his voice sharp with frustration as he barked orders that no longer meant anything. Run it again, he snapped, even though everyone already knew what the result would be. A perfect report. A silent engine. Around him, a dozen technicians shifted, glancing at each other, their confidence cracking under the weight of something they couldn't explain. The hum of generators and distant taxiing aircraft filled the background, but here, around this jet, there was a strange pocket of stillness, like the world itself was waiting. And just beyond that circle of urgency stood an old man. Ethan Cole didn't belong to the noise. He stood a few feet back from the aircraft, hands resting loosely at his sides, a worn leather jacket hanging off his shoulders despite the heat, its edges faded and creased from decades of use. His jeans were plain, his boots dusty, his presence almost invisible to the men rushing past him. Almost. One of the security airmen finally noticed. "Sir, you can't be here," the young man said, stepping forward with forced authority, his voice not quite steady. Ethan turned his head slightly, his pale blue eyes calm, unreadable, taking in the aircraft instead of the warning. He didn't move, didn't argue, didn't explain, just watched. The airman hesitated, uncertain now, glancing back toward Lieutenant Carter, who was already storming over, irritation radiating off him. "What is this?" Carter demanded, gesturing toward Ethan like he was pointing at a problem to be removed. "Who let a civilian onto my tarmac?" His words carried, sharp enough to draw attention from nearby crews, and even a few VIP observers waiting behind the safety line for the demonstration flight that was now long overdue. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. The moment stretched. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, steady, almost lost beneath the distant whine of another jet taking off. "This aircraft isn't dead." Carter let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind that came from someone who trusted data more than instinct. "We've got 12 certified technicians, 3 diagnostic systems, and direct support from Lockheed," he shot back. "This jet is done until we figure out why." Ethan's gaze didn't shift. Not to Carter. Not to the airman. Only to the F-16. "You're not listening to it," he said quietly. And for just a second, barely noticeable, easy to miss, something in the air changed. Not louder. Not faster. Just heavier. Like a truth had entered the space and hadn't yet been acknowledged. Ryan Carter stepped closer, boots striking the concrete with controlled aggression, the kind that came from a man who had never been wrong in front of his team before. He stopped just short of Ethan, close enough to establish authority, far enough to avoid acknowledging him as an equal. "We are listening to it," he said, his tone tightening, each word measured and edged with irritation. "That is exactly what these systems are for." He gestured sharply toward the open laptops, their screens glowing under the harsh sunlight, lines of data scrolling in precise, sterile perfection. "This aircraft talks through telemetry, not guesswork." A few of the technicians nodded, relieved to anchor themselves to something familiar, something modern, something that made sense. One of them, a young specialist barely out of training, muttered quietly, "All systems are green across the board." Another added, "We have run the startup sequence 4 times. There is no fault code." The words sounded confident, but the confidence did not hold. It hung in the air, thin and brittle, like glass under pressure. Ethan did not look at the screens. He did not look at the men. His eyes remained fixed on the aircraft, tracing lines no one else seemed to notice, the subtle angles of panels, the way the sunlight caught along the intake, the faint shimmer rising off the metal skin. He took a slow step forward, and that alone shifted the mood. Not because of the movement, but because of how deliberate it was. Unhurried, certain, as if he was not approaching a machine, but something alive. "Sir, I need you to step back," the airman said again, more firmly this time, though the edge of uncertainty had crept into his voice. Ethan stopped, but only for a moment, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something deeper than the audible world. The distant whine of another jet passed overhead, its echo rolling across the runway, but Ethan did not react to that. He was focused on something closer, something quieter. Ryan exhaled sharply, turning halfway back to his team. "This is exactly the problem," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Too many opinions, not enough discipline." A few of the technicians let out short, uneasy laughs, eager to align themselves with his authority. He turned back to Ethan, his expression hardening. "You said it is not dead," he continued. "Then tell me what it is." There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to make the question feel heavier than intended. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, finally acknowledging Ryan, but not with challenge. With something else. Something older. "It is waiting," he said. The answer landed without impact at first, as if no one quite understood what to do with it. Then Ryan let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. "Waiting," he repeated, the word laced with disbelief. "That is not how this works." He stepped past Ethan, dismissing him with the movement, returning his attention to the aircraft. "We fix problems with data, not poetry." The team refocused, fingers moving over keyboards, cables being checked again, procedures repeated with growing urgency. But the tension did not ease. If anything, it tightened. Because despite everything they knew, everything they trusted, the aircraft remained exactly the same. Silent, unresponsive. And behind them, just a few steps away, Ethan Cole stood still once more, his presence quiet but immovable, like a shadow that did not belong to the light around it. He closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, and in that moment, the noise of the tarmac seemed to fall away. Not completely, just enough. Enough for something else to surface. A rhythm. Faint. Familiar. And when his eyes opened again, they did not hold doubt. They held recognition. The technicians kept working, but the rhythm was off now, like a band playing out of sync without realizing it. Commands were repeated, checks were rerun, and yet nothing changed. The aircraft remained still, its silence no longer just a malfunction, but something heavier, something that pressed against the edges of their confidence. Ryan Carter crouched near the forward landing gear, tablet in hand, scanning through the same diagnostics for the 5th time, his jaw tightening with each identical result. "There is nothing wrong with this system," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, as if saying it enough times might make it true. Behind him, Ethan Cole took another slow step forward. This time, no one stopped him. Not because they allowed it, but because no one noticed soon enough. His boots made almost no sound against the concrete, yet his presence seemed to draw the air inward, tightening the space around the aircraft. He moved along the left side of the jet, his hand hovering just inches from the surface without touching it, his eyes tracing the seams of the panels, the alignment of rivets, the subtle interplay of shadow and light across the fuselage. To anyone else, it was just metal. To him, it was language. He paused near the intake, head tilting slightly again, listening. Not to the loud, obvious sounds of the tarmac, but to something beneath them, something that did not come through speakers or sensors. A faint irregularity. A silence where there should have been presence. Ryan stood up abruptly, turning back toward the team. "We are not restarting this again until I understand what we are missing," he said, his voice sharper now, edged with frustration that no longer hid behind professionalism. He glanced toward Ethan, finally noticing how close he had gotten. "You," he called out, pointing. "Step away from the aircraft." The command carried authority, but it did not land the way he expected. Ethan did not flinch. He did not argue. He simply looked at a specific point along the fuselage, just beneath a small access panel near the intake, his gaze narrowing slightly. It was almost nothing. A fraction of an inch. A line that did not sit perfectly flush with the rest of the aircraft's skin. Something so minor it would not trigger any system alert. Something no software would flag. "That panel," Ethan said quietly. Ryan followed his gaze, irritation flickering into disbelief. That panel is sealed and torqued to spec, he replied immediately. We checked it. One of the technicians nodded. Factory alignment. Zero deviation within tolerance. Ethan stepped closer, just enough to stand within arm's reach now. Did you open it? He asked. Ryan let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. Why would we open a panel that shows no fault? He shot back. That is not how this works. Ethan's eyes remained on the panel. That is exactly how it works, he said, his voice still calm, still steady, but carrying something deeper now. Not defiance. Certainty. The kind that did not need approval. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The wind shifted slightly across the runway, carrying with it the distant echo of another engine spooling up somewhere far off. But here, around this aircraft, everything felt contained. Focused. The smallest details seemed louder than before. The faint shimmer of heat, the subtle vibration of air, the almost invisible misalignment of that panel. Ryan hesitated, just for a second, and that second did not go unnoticed. Lucas Bennett, standing a few steps back, watched the exchange with growing unease. He had been quiet the entire time, observing, listening, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been trained to believe. But something about the old man did not fit into any system he knew. It was not what he said. It was how he stood, how he saw things no one else even thought to look for. Lucas glanced down at his phone, then back at Ethan, then at Ryan, his mind racing through a decision he was not supposed to make. And in that moment, as the tension on the tarmac tightened to a near breaking point, Lucas stepped back, just slightly, turning away from the group as his fingers moved quickly across the screen, dialing a number he had no business calling. Lucas Bennett moved farther from the aircraft, just enough to break out of the immediate circle of noise and authority, his back half turned as he pressed the phone to his ear, shielding the screen with his hand, as if that alone could hide what he was doing. The line rang once, then twice, each second stretching longer than it should have, until a voice finally answered. Sharp and controlled. Command operations. Lucas swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Sir, this is Airman First Class Lucas Bennett on the tarmac at runway 3. I need to report something. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that carried weight. Go ahead. Lucas glanced back over his shoulder. Ryan Carter was still standing near the aircraft, arms crossed again, watching Ethan now with a growing irritation that had not yet turned into action. The rest of the team hovered in uncertainty, caught between protocol and something they could not define. Lucas lowered his voice. There is a civilian here. Name is Ethan Cole. Another pause. Longer this time. The ambient noise of the line seemed to disappear, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate. Repeat the name, the voice said. Lucas blinked, surprised. Ethan Cole, sir. What followed was not immediate. It was not loud. It was a shift. Subtle, but undeniable. Papers moving. A chair scraping somewhere far away. Then the voice came back, different now. Tighter. Focused. Stay where you are. Do not remove him from the area. Do you understand? Lucas hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his training pulling one way, his instincts another. Yes, sir, he said finally. The line disconnected. Lucas lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat now louder in his ears than the distant engines across the base. He looked back toward the aircraft, toward the old man who still stood beside that slightly misaligned panel. And for the first time, Lucas felt something he could not quite name. Not fear. Not confusion. Something closer to realization. Back near the jet, Ryan exhaled sharply, the patience he had been holding onto now thinning to a breaking point. We are done entertaining this, he said, his voice cutting clean across the group. This aircraft is grounded until engineering signs off. That is procedure. He turned toward Ethan, stepping forward with renewed authority. Step away from the jet. Now. This time, the command landed harder. The nearby technicians straightened slightly, the structure of command reasserting itself, giving them something solid to stand on again. But Ethan did not move. He did not even look at Ryan. His attention remained fixed on that panel, his expression unchanged, as if the command had simply passed through him without resistance or acknowledgement. The wind shifted again, brushing lightly across the tarmac, carrying with it the faint scent of fuel and heated metal. Ethan's hand rose slowly, not touching the aircraft yet, but hovering just above the surface, fingers slightly curled as if feeling something just out of reach. "This aircraft tried to tell you," he said quietly. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet they landed in the center of the moment. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Aircraft do not try anything," he snapped. "They respond to inputs." Ethan's hand lowered slightly, stopping just short of contact. "That is where you are wrong," he replied. There was no challenge in his tone. No edge. Just a statement, delivered with the weight of something lived rather than learned. For a brief second, the space between them felt different. Not louder. Not more intense. Just deeper. As if two entirely different ways of understanding the world had collided without either one stepping back. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a distant sound cut through the air. Not loud at first. Just the low, unmistakable growl of an approaching vehicle moving faster than anything should on an active tarmac. Heads turned instinctively. The technicians looked up. Even Ryan paused, his attention pulled away for the first time. The sound grew louder, closer, the tires rolling hard against the concrete, closing the distance with purpose. And standing beside the silent aircraft, Ethan Cole did not turn at all. The sound of the approaching vehicle cut sharper now, rolling across the concrete with a controlled urgency that did not belong to routine operations. It was not fast in a reckless way, but it carried intent, the kind that made people move without being told. The technicians stepped back instinctively, clearing space as a dark command vehicle came into view, its tires gripping the tarmac with a low, steady growl before coming to a precise stop just yards from the aircraft. The engine idled for only a second before the door opened. A tall figure stepped out, uniform crisp despite the heat, presence unmistakable even before rank insignia could be clearly seen. Conversations died immediately. Movement slowed. The atmosphere shifted from tension to something heavier, more controlled. General Harrison Blake did not rush. He did not need to. His gaze swept once across the scene, taking in the aircraft, the scattered equipment, the technicians, and finally, the old man standing beside the fuselage. For a brief moment, nothing else existed in his line of sight. Ryan Carter straightened instantly, posture snapping into place as training overrode everything else. "Sir," he called out, stepping forward, voice firm but carrying a trace of surprise he could not fully conceal. "We have a systems anomaly. We are currently." "Why is he still standing out here?" Blake's voice cut through his explanation, calm but absolute. It was not raised. It did not need to be. The question landed with more force than any command. Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, caught between explaining and understanding what had just been asked. "Sir." Blake did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan Cole. "I asked," the general said, each word deliberate, "why he is still standing out here." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not confusion. It was realization beginning to form, though not yet complete. Ryan glanced back at Ethan, then at the general, his confidence shifting, recalibrating in real time. "Sir, he is a civilian. He entered a restricted area without authorization. We were in the process of removing him." Blake finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Ryan, but not enough to break the weight of his presence. "You were removing him," he repeated, the words neutral, but something underneath them was not. Ryan felt it. The technicians felt it. Even Lucas, standing off to the side, felt it settle across the tarmac like a pressure drop before a storm. Blake stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the aircraft, his pace measured, controlled. He stopped a few feet from Ethan, not in front of him, not behind him, but beside him, aligning himself with the same line of sight toward the jet. For a moment, neither man spoke. The general's eyes moved across the surface of the aircraft, following the same path Ethan had traced earlier, as if seeing through a lens most had never been given. Then, quietly, almost as if confirming something to himself, Blake spoke. "You noticed it too." It was not a question. Ethan did not turn. "It is subtle," he replied, "but it is there." Blake gave the smallest nod, the kind that would be missed if anyone blinked at the wrong moment. Behind them, Ryan Carter stood frozen, the structure he relied on no longer. Behaving the way it should. This was not procedure. This was not protocol. This was something else entirely. Something he had not been trained for. Blake turned slightly, finally facing the team, his expression composed but his voice carrying a new edge. one that left no room for interpretation. "Clear the area," he said. "This aircraft is no longer under your control." No one moved at first, not out of defiance, but because the meaning of those words had not yet fully landed. Then one technician stepped back, then another. Equipment was lifted. Cables were pulled away. Space opened around the aircraft, not in chaos, but in quiet compliance. And at the center of it all, Ethan Cole stood beside the jet, the same way he had from the beginning, unchanged, as if the world had finally caught up to where he already was. The space around the aircraft cleared with a quiet efficiency that spoke louder than any shouted command, tools disappearing, cables coiled, laptops closed, until the noise that had once surrounded the jet faded into a distant hum, leaving behind a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, and heavy with expectation. Ryan Carter did not move at first. He stood where he was, tablet still in his hand, the screen now dimming under the sun as if even it had nothing left to offer. His mind worked to reconcile what he had just heard, what he had just seen, but the pieces did not fit. Not yet. General Harrison Blake's order echoed in his head, not because it was loud, but because it had been absolute. "This aircraft is no longer under your control." The words did not just remove authority. They replaced it. Blake stepped slightly back, giving space without stepping away, his presence still anchoring the moment as his eyes remained on Ethan. There was no urgency in his posture, no impatience, only a quiet readiness, as if he already knew what would happen next and saw no need to rush it. Ethan Cole finally moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a small shift forward, closing the final inches between himself and the aircraft. His hand rose again, this time making contact, fingers resting lightly against the metal surface just below the misaligned panel. The touch was gentle, almost careful, as if acknowledging something rather than forcing it. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as his focus deepened. The world around him seemed to recede, not disappearing, but softening at the edges, leaving only the aircraft, the panel, and the faint rhythm he had sensed earlier. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, worn leather pouch, its surface creased and darkened by years of use, the snap polished smooth from repetition. It did not belong here, not among modern equipment and digital systems, yet in his hand, it felt exactly where it was supposed to be. Ryan watched, unable to look away now, the earlier irritation replaced by something quieter, something closer to disbelief. There was no advanced tool, no diagnostic device, just that pouch. Ethan opened it with practiced ease, revealing a few simple instruments, metal worn but cared for, each piece carrying a history no one else in that moment could see. He selected one, small and unremarkable to the untrained eye, and stepped closer to the panel. "You missed it because it does not register as a failure," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, not directed at anyone, yet heard by everyone. "It registers as normal." Ryan swallowed, the words landing deeper than he expected. Ethan's fingers moved with precision, loosening the panel just enough to expose what lay beneath without disturbing anything unnecessary. The movement was efficient, exact, with no wasted motion, as if every step had been done 1,000 times before under conditions far less forgiving than this quiet tarmac. As the panel shifted slightly, the difference became visible, not dramatic, not obvious, but undeniable once seen. A subtle misalignment within, a component seated just off enough to disrupt a system that otherwise appeared perfect. Ethan paused, studying it for a fraction of a second, then made a small adjustment, barely more than a touch, guided not by data, but by instinct refined through years no system could replicate. He secured the panel again, tightening it with the same care, the same precision, then stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet completion. The silence that followed was deeper than anything before it. General Blake watched without speaking, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharp with recognition. Ryan stood still, the tablet in his hand now forgotten, his understanding shifting in real time as the gap between knowledge and experience revealed itself, in a way no training had prepared him for. And at the center of it all, Ethan Cole simply looked at the aircraft, as if waiting for it to answer. For a moment, nothing happened. The aircraft remained still, the same silent shape against the heat shimmer of the runway, giving no sign that anything had changed. The technicians watched from a distance, their movements frozen, their attention locked on the jet as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Ryan Carter did not speak. He could not. His eyes moved between Ethan's hand, now resting at his side, and the panel that had just been opened and closed with a simplicity that made everything they had done before feel excessive. General Harrison Blake shifted his weight slightly, just enough to signal the next step without breaking the silence. "Run the startup," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying absolute confidence without needing emphasis. Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then turned sharply toward his team, the habit of command returning, though now tempered by something else. "Initiate startup sequence," he ordered. The words sounded the same as before, but they did not feel the same. One of the technicians moved quickly to the console, fingers hovering over the controls before committing, pressing the sequence with a precision that bordered on caution. The system engaged. A low electrical hum began to build, subtle at first, then growing, spreading through the aircraft like a pulse returning to something that had been asleep. The avionics flickered to life, screens illuminating within the cockpit, indicators aligning one by one, each signal falling into place with a quiet certainty that had been missing before. Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, watching the data stream in, every parameter now shifting from static perfection to dynamic response. Fuel flow adjusted. Pressure stabilized. The numbers moved the way they were supposed to move, the way they had refused to move before. Then came the sound. It started as a distant whine, barely audible beneath the hum, but it grew steadily, smoothly, without hesitation. The engine spooled up, not in a sudden burst, but in a controlled rise, a measured return to life that carried none of the resistance they had fought for hours. The intake pulled air with purpose. The vibrations settled into a steady rhythm. The aircraft answered. No alarms. No hesitation. Just a clean, undeniable response. A technician stepped back instinctively, eyes wide, as if witnessing something he could not fully explain. Another glanced at his screen, then back at the jet, then back again, searching for an inconsistency that was no longer there. Ryan Carter stood completely still, the tablet in his hand now dark, forgotten, as the reality of what had just happened settled in without asking for permission. He had all the data, all the tools, all the systems, and none of it had been enough. Behind him, the faint murmur of distant operations continued, unchanged, but here, around this aircraft, everything had shifted. The air felt different, quieter, even with the engine now alive. General Blake did not react outwardly. He did not smile. He did not speak immediately. He simply watched, his gaze steady, as if confirming something that had never been in doubt for him. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward Ethan Cole. Ethan did not look at the engine. He did not look at the technicians. He only watched the aircraft for a brief second longer, as if making sure it had fully returned to itself, then gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, before stepping back. No satisfaction, no pride, just completion. Around him, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The engine's steady hum settled into the background, no longer the center of attention, but a quiet confirmation of what had just taken place, a living proof that required no explanation. The technicians stood in a loose semicircle now, not by instruction but by instinct, each of them holding position as if stepping any closer might break whatever had just been restored. Ryan Carter finally lowered the tablet from his hand, the device slipping to his side as his posture changed, not visibly at first, but enough that the authority he had carried earlier no longer defined him in the same way. He looked at the aircraft, then at the panel, then at Ethan Cole, and for the first time since the beginning, there was no resistance left in his expression, only recognition. General Harrison Blake took a single step forward, his boots firm against the concrete, his presence drawing the focus of everyone without effort. He stopped beside Ethan, not ahead of him, not behind him, but level, his posture straight, his gaze steady. For a brief moment, the two men stood in silence, the sound of the running engine behind them filling the space like a low, constant reminder of something larger than any one person on that tarmac. Then Blake spoke. "You always did prefer listening over looking," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a familiarity that had not been present before. It was not a question. It was not even a statement meant for the others. It was something older. Ethan gave a slight nod, his eyes still on the aircraft. Machines do not lie, he replied quietly. People just forget how to hear them. The words settled across the group, simple and direct, yet heavier than any technical explanation that could have been given. Ryan shifted his weight, stepping forward now, not out of authority, but out of something closer to humility. He stopped a few feet away, careful with the distance, as if unsure of where he now stood in relation to the moment. Sir, he said, addressing Blake first, then glancing toward Ethan. I did not. He paused, the words failing to form the way they usually did. Blake turned his head slightly, acknowledging him without breaking the calm of the scene. You followed your training, the general said. That is not the problem. Ryan swallowed, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, though not disappearing. Then what is? He asked, the question quieter now, stripped of the edge it had carried before. Blake's gaze returned to the aircraft, then shifted briefly to Ethan, before settling back on Ryan. Training teaches you where to look, he said. Experience teaches you what matters. The distinction hung in the air, clear and undeniable. Behind them, one of the technicians adjusted his stance, lowering his gaze to the ground. The earlier confidence replaced by a quiet understanding that something had been missing, something no system could provide. Lucas Bennett stood off to the side, phone still in his hand, though he no longer needed it. He watched the exchange with a stillness that mirrored Ethan's earlier presence, the pieces finally aligning in his mind, not through instruction, but through what he had witnessed. Ethan reached into his jacket again, placing the small leather pouch back where it belonged, the motion unremarkable, almost invisible, yet it marked the end of something. He took a single step back from the aircraft, creating space, returning it to those who would now maintain it. No claim, no announcement, just quiet departure. Blake straightened slightly, then, without hesitation, brought his hand up in a precise, deliberate motion. It was not exaggerated. It was not for display. It was exact. A salute. Not to rank, not to position, but to something deeper. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then Ryan Carter, almost instinctively, followed. Then one technician. Then another. The line formed without command, without instruction, each man raising his hand in silence. The gesture spreading across the tarmac until the only sound left was the steady hum of the engine and the quiet acknowledgement of something they had not understood until now. The salutes held for a moment longer than necessary, not out of protocol, but because no one wanted to be the first to lower their hand. The engine behind them continued its steady rhythm, a low, controlled hum that now felt less like machinery and more like confirmation, as if the aircraft itself had acknowledged what had just taken place. Then, slowly, General Harrison Blake lowered his hand, and the others followed, the movement quiet, almost reluctant, as the moment settled into memory. Ethan Cole did not return the salute. He simply stood there for a second, taking in the aircraft one last time, his eyes moving across its surface with a calm familiarity, as if saying something without words. Then he turned. No announcement. No recognition sought. Just a simple turn, his boots pressing lightly against the concrete as he began to walk away from the aircraft, from the formation, from the center of attention he had never asked for. Ryan Carter watched him go, the distance between them growing with each step, but the weight of what had happened closing in instead of fading. He took a step forward, then stopped, unsure for the first time in a long time whether he had the right to call out, to speak, to interrupt that quiet exit. Sir, he said finally, the word coming out softer than he expected, not directed at the general this time, but at the man walking away. Ethan paused, but did not turn immediately, just enough to acknowledge the voice. Ryan took another step, his posture no longer rigid, his tone stripped of everything that had come before. I should have listened, he said. The words were simple, but they carried everything he could not fully articulate. Ethan remained still for a brief moment, then turned his head just slightly, enough for his voice to carry back without raising it. You were listening, he replied, just not to the right things. There was no judgment in it, no correction, just clarity. Ryan nodded once, the motion small but firm, as if something inside him had finally settled into place. Ethan continued walking, his figure moving past the edge of the tarmac, past the lines of equipment and personnel, until he became just another shape against the broader landscape of the base, indistinguishable to anyone who had not been there to see what he had done. The engine behind them continued to run, steady and reliable, the demonstration that had been delayed now quietly ready to proceed, though no one seemed in a hurry anymore. General Blake turned his attention back to the aircraft, then to Ryan, his gaze measured but not unkind. "You will remember this," he said. It was not a question. Ryan met his eyes, the earlier certainty replaced by something deeper, something more grounded. "Yes, sir," he answered. Blake gave a small nod, then looked once more toward the direction Ethan had gone, though the man himself was no longer visible. "Good," he said quietly. Around them, the tarmac slowly returned to motion, technicians stepping back into their roles, equipment being repositioned, procedures resuming, but the energy had changed. It was quieter now, more deliberate, as if every action carried a little more weight than before. Lucas Bennett slipped his phone back into his pocket, his gaze lingering on the empty space where Ethan had stood, the realization settling in not as a sudden revelation, but as something that would stay with him long after this moment passed. The aircraft remained ready, the system restored, the mission back on track, but none of it felt like the same routine anymore. Because somewhere between the silence of a machine and the certainty of a man who refused to raise his voice, something had shifted that no system could measure. And as the engine's steady hum filled the air once more, it carried with it a quiet truth that did not need to be spoken aloud. Experience does not announce itself. It simply shows up, does what matters, and leaves before anyone fully understands what they were given.